Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 strangest tanks ever designed. And just before we get into it, we're doing this video with some friends of ours, Top Lists, another fantastic YouTube channel making list videos, and if you like our stuff, you are bound to like theirs. So this is the first half of the list, and as part of this collaboration, at the end you're going to see a link over to the second part which they've done on their channel. Now, we wrote the list together, it's all a team effort, so do go over and check it out, and I'm sure you'll really enjoy it. So that's it, let's get started with the video.
A7V from Germany. The A7V tank was built and designed during the later stages of World War I in response to the tanks that the British were using on the battlefield. However, unlike the British tanks, the A7V was built by a tractor maker, a fact that was glaringly obvious to anyone that rode in it. It was basically a huge steel box fitted onto a tractor chassis. The only good thing about it was that it was well armed. They had between 7 to 8 machine guns with thousands of rounds of ammunition on board. Unfortunately, most never got to the battlefield, either because the crews kept passing out from the heat inside the tank, or because it kept getting stuck in the mud. Antonov A40 from Russia. Not satisfied with the tank as a vehicle capable of destroying and driving over everything in its path, the Russians tried to make them even better by teaching them how to fly. Behold the Antonov A40, basically a tank strapped to a glorified glider. However, in order to reduce the tank's weight so that it was capable of flight, it had to be stripped of all of its ammunition, a big problem when your main purpose is to fire this ammunition into the faces of the Nazis. Luckily, the Antonov never entered combat, the military test flew it once, and despite its safe landing, they proceeded to forget about the whole thing. Sherman Flail Crab from the USA. The Sherman Flail Crab tank is proof that sometimes the craziest people in the office do the best job. Aside from being a fully working Sherman tank, its main job was to clear minefields by beating the daylights out of them with chains. On the front of the tank, its designers mounted a series of drums with chains attached to them, and a motor that would rotate the whole array. Upon reaching the minefield, the motor would be kick-started, and the chains would spin round and round, harmlessly detonating any mines they came into contact with. All we're wondering is why they bothered fitting this tank with a gun when they could have just pointed it at the enemy and terrified them into surrendering. Tsar tank, Russia. The Tsar tank was Russia's answer to the problem of how to break through the German front lines of World War I. Unfortunately, as you can see, that answer was ridiculous. The Tsar was essentially a larger version of a tricycle, but with a cannon instead of a small child. However, whilst the first two wheels were stable enough to cross even the most treacherous terrain and even crush a few trees, the little wheel at the back wasn't so maneuverable. On its first test run, it got stuck in a patch of mud. Since nothing could be found strong enough to pull it out, the Russians abandoned it until 1923, when it was dismantled for scrap metal. Christie Amphibious tank from the USA. Built by inventor J. Walter Christie in 1921, the Christie Amphibious tank was intended to be used by the army during beach landings to both land onshore and blow any enemy resistance to hell. It was armed with a 75mm gun, however, the weight of the gun combined with the weight of the quarter-inch armor that surrounded the sides meant it came in at over 7 tons in total. Shockingly, the military decided to pass on this tank, so Christie came back a few years later with a much lighter version, this time for the US Marines. They too passed on it, namely because somebody realized that it was open-topped and that the soldiers inside might want a protective roof over their heads.
So I really hope you enjoyed that video. As I said, this is a collaboration with our friends at Top Lists. On the screen now, there is a video playing, and you can just click that to go and check out the rest of this list. Before you go, I'd love it if you clicked like below, though it really helps us out. And I really hope you enjoy the rest of the list, and thank you for watching.
Okay, so the armor only protects the torso of the driver. Also, we can't imagine this would get very far over hilly terrain, and as a result, this was never mass-produced. Number 9. The 1K17 Szhatie. Don't let the massively boring